So thank you so much for staying put. I'm going to try and, sort of summarize this in a very interesting sort of a way. Uh, I'm not going to speak at all about imagery. I'm not going to speak at all about, what do you say, the conventional tenets of the design. The idea is to look at, basically most of the office spaces that we do typically are designed for corporates. Corporates are known to use a lot of jargons, a lot of invented terms. And always we are trying to make efforts to decode that jargon. However, I'm sure all of us must have come across a lot of clients who do a lot of plain speak. And architects cannot respond in a very simplified manner to that plain speak. And we definitely need to decode that plain speak as well. So it is my effort to put together about 5 or 6 sort of pointers that I have come across in my career of last 23 years in strategizing the workplaces, designing the workplace, and so on and so forth. So the presentation is titled Decoding Workplace Colloquial. So hello. So what does colloquial literally mean? It basically used in spoken conversation, not in formal situations. So you'll see a lot of insights of like that, clients speaking to you in a particular colloquial manner, and how do you as an architect translate all of that? So the presentation basically goes in a format where I'm going to tell you what we hear, how we as architects interpret that, and what do we typically manifest it, or what are the sense of semantics or the adjectives that we typically try and follow from that. The first colloquial that I come across very often is that I want an office space which is zen or minimal. Yeah, we are not in Japan. We are not going to create a Japanese garden. We are not going to create a stone garden. But ultimately, what does it mean in a literal workspace scenario? So essentially, how do we interpret this? My take on anybody wanting a zen or a minimal workspace is very simple. One has to just get the workspace rather than using a lot of intellectual ability to understand how the workspace can be used, how the workspace can be interacted with, what actually is rather than what we think it is. Basically, it has to be intuitive, balanced, and harmonious. A very simple snippet being, people do tend to move into new offices. They tend to get sort of overwhelmed in terms of how am I going to access washrooms, how am I going to access reprographic areas, how am I going to access fire egress corridors, and so on and so forth. So ultimately, the workspace would be designed in such a manner that, probably, one has to just get it in a very easy sort of a manner. A lot of aesthetical inputs, a lot of aesthetical insights and planning insights will go into this approach. So what we typically manifest in terms of the semantics of this is that rather than designing workspaces which are cosmetic, we can design workspaces which are absolutely fundamental in nature. Rather than creating complex workspaces, an effort can be taken from a planning aspect to design workplaces which are rather intuitive. And rather than creating a sense of imbalance, one has to have a very calibrated sort of an approach, be it planning, be it the aesthetics, or be it the materiality, so on and so forth. Second colloquial that we typically see is that we want an absolutely high technology workspace, without even knowing what it actually is going to mean. So ultimately, what does it actually mean? So today, workplaces are just more than tables and chairs. It's a complex milieu of people, function, and technology. Ultimately, for any workspace to work in a beautiful manner, all of these materials or all of these elements has to coexist harmoniously rather than best in isolation. I cannot have a fancy audio video system and expect it if people are going to get scared away with, in terms of how to go about it. So ultimately, the inspired use of technology needs to bind apparently random elements to make it a whole. So my take on this from a planning standpoint is that rather than having disparate elements, we need to look at a sense of convergence where the technology, people, and all of that sort of comes together. Third colloquial speak is, I want a future-proof workspace. I want to bring, future to my present, reasonably timelessness. So ultimately, the way I look at it is very simple. Workspace design is evolving with every passing day. We saw that in the first presentation from probably last 50 odd years, workspaces were very simple, table, chairs, typewriters, probably eventually phones came, then the computers, and so on and so forth. Contemporary trends are becoming, passe with every passing day. What is like fast tends to be disliked equally faster. We spoke about attention spans. So basically, a reasonably timeless design can mitigate the risk of being out of fashion. There has to be an opportunity to adopt to micro trends without significant investment of time and money that will basically keep these workspaces reasonably timeless and can bring future to the present. So rather than being trendy, we can have elements which can actually defy future. That's where the approach can be. my favorite. I want an office to look like Facebook, Google, or WeWork, mindlessly. Uh, the way I look at it is very simple. Why people want or why people have developed an affinity for the offices like that? So ultimately what's happening is that, in about last 2 decades or 3 decades, 5 to 10,000 square feet workspaces have grown to 500,000 or a million square feet workspaces where 10 to 15,000 people sort of come and work with. So large offices tend to obviously become monotonous because, how much ever you try to avoid, you're going to see a sea of heads, sea of workstations, cubicles, and so on and so forth. So eclectic elements, to propagate the impetus for innovation, how do we do that? So everybody has a different take on it. Modern day business dynamics calls flexibility. Hence you have meeting rooms that can get converted into cabins and training rooms that can be, amalgamated and so on and so forth. So ultimately the workspaces, those are sensitive to the tools of the trade required by work profile rather than the designation is how we interpret, ultimately what people like in this office. Ultimately eclecticism is something that people fancy. So rather than creating offices which are mundane, we can create some degree of orderly chaos where people can stumble upon interesting things, can sort of visualize the space all over again. Rather than a rigid profile, we can have an agile sort of a workplace. And rather than creating a hierarchical workspace, the workspace has to be, designed in a manner it is workplace or work profile based. Again, a fifth sort of a colloquial that comes to my way is, I want a world-class international look and feel and global trendy looking office. Ultimately, what we need to see is that rather than the blind copying, we have to see, we have to have a seamless merger of, global best practices, trends, as well as local sensibilities, which I think Santha also tried to show from her presentation. Ultimately, optimizing premium real estate with, efficient density and the, designed workspaces need to be cost sensitive and value driven. So rather than having an indiscriminate sort of an approach, we can, have an absolutely contextual sort of an approach. So just to summarize it, rather than creating workspaces which are cosmetic, we can look at a fundamental approach. Rather than creating workspaces which are complex, we can look at an intuitive sort of an approach. Rather than creating a sense of imbalance, we can have some degree of calibration. Rather than having disparate elements which are not doing anything as a whole, we can have convergence of multiple different elements coming into picture. Creating some degree of orderly chaos to have that fun, add agility to it, create work profile based sort of a scenario, and ultimately, last but not the least, absolutely contextual sort of a scenario. So thank you very much. I hope that you found it interesting.